Okay, good evening. I'm Sunil Khilnani. I'm the director of the India Institute, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome all of you to our Tagore Center Distinguished Lectures for 2015. And these are run under the auspices of the Tagore Center for Global Thought here at the India Institute. The Tagore Center for Global Thought was established with the generous support of the Ministry of Culture of the Government of India, and it was formally inaugurated in 2013, in April of that year, by the Indian Minister of Culture at Somerset House, East Wing. The Tagore Center is housed in the King's India Institute, and while it commemorates the 150th birth anniversary of Rabindranath Tagore and his own work, our purpose in creating it wasn't simply to memorialize the many facets of Tagore's work, but rather to make the center an active platform, indeed a kind of crossroads, that can connect some of the most interesting and sometimes overlooked Indian intellectual traditions and arguments with wider global debates and inquiry. And we do this in various ways. We do it through providing funded PhD studentships, specifically to explore India's intellectual traditions, an area that's not very often funded in that way. We do it through a visiting fellows program, and we do it through seminars, lectures, and also film series. We've just had a very successful film series called Indian Modernism, I think. But the flagship of the center's activities is our Distinguished Lecture series. And these lectures, which take place over 3 evenings, are held every 2 years. And this is our second iteration of that series. The first set of Tagore Distinguished Lectures was delivered in November 2013 by Professor Rahul Mehrotra of Harvard University on the topic of architecture and urbanism in 21st century India. And those of you who attended those will remember them as a scintillating intellectual occasion. And a recording of those is available on our website. Today, we embark on a very different exploration of a different kind of topic. And I'm really pleased to be able to welcome to the India Institute and to King's Dr. Swapan Dasgupta. Dr. Dasgupta began his career as an academic, but living in a moment in India when the pace of change has often been too fast for the academic world to keep up with, he moved into journalism. And after serving first in editorial positions on all of India's leading publications, he now, for more than a dozen years, has been an independent columnist. He writes regularly for the Times of India, the Calcutta Telegraph, and also has columns appearing in the Asian Age, the Hindustan Times, and the Pioneer newspaper. And he'll, of course, be very familiar to many of you as a frequent commentator on India's TV news channels. He's established himself as a forceful and often contrarian writer and commentator, though now, of course, many of his views have at least arguably become part of the mainstream, although I'm sure he'd perhaps disagree with that. The topic which almost exactly a year ago I invited Swapan to reflect upon is, I think, one of great importance, but it's actually received rather little sustained attention or study. And that is the nature of conservatism in India. Whether and to what extent it might form either an ideology or a political movement or even a tradition. Is there such a thing as an Indian conservatism? And if so, what is it? Can we distinguish it from nationalism? And if so, how? And if there is such a thing as Indian conservatism, what are its views on economics, on culture and social change, and on individual liberty? And how does Indian conservatism relate to other varieties of conservatism across the world? What sort of politics of government might it have now that one version of it is in government? So over the next 3 evenings, Swapan will explore these and other questions of his own, no doubt. His topic tomorrow is entitled Indian Conservatism as a Protest Movement, and Wednesday's lecture is entitled Indian Conservatism and the Compulsions of Political Power. And I invite, indeed I urge you, all of you, to come to these 2 lectures over successive nights as well, since I think it's only over the course of the 3 lectures that the full complexity and sophistication of the arguments will become clear. I should also say that after tomorrow's and Wednesday's lectures, you in the audience will have an opportunity to ask questions, which Swapan has very kindly agreed to answer. After tonight's lecture, though, there won't be any questions. Instead, we'll adjourn to a drinks reception, which will be held in this room immediately following the end of the lecture, and to which all of you are invited. So to this evening's lecture, whose title is How Conservative is Indian Conservatism? Swapan.
Thank you, Sunil, for these very kind words. Extremely generous of you, and I suspect you're going to get trolled quite a lot on Twitter for according a degree of respectability to what has been deemed completely unrespectable. I must first apologize because the synopsis of the lecture, as I put out, as has been published in the website, actually contains a little more than I'm going to address today. Today, I'm going to confine myself primarily to this question of how conservative is Indian conservatism, and basically explore the foundations, the intellectual foundations of what can conceivably be called Indian conservatism and its relationship with other tendencies, trends, which have been there mainly in the Anglophone world. I'll start from the present, though. After the election of 2014, there were various interpretations offered of the mandate. One particular one, which I found significant, was one by a historian in Cambridge, Shruti Kapila. Some of you may be familiar with her work. And she wrote that Modi's victory has declared the arrival of a distinctive brand of conservatism. In India today, conservatism has acquired a kind of revolutionary import in that it is a byword for change. Now, this, to my mind, is a significant departure. Because if you look at the earlier literature on the subject, I can only cite in 1967 an American academic, H.L. Erdman, who wrote the only book probably on the Swatantra Party. He said that it has been part of the conventional wisdom about Indian politics that right-wing political activity, and here he's using right-wing almost synonymously with conservatism, has been extremely ineffectual. Now, in the context of today, I would say that the word ineffectual may be a bit misplaced. Even if we were to argue that what took place in 2014 was an aberration, and there are a lot of commentators who believe that what happened in 2014 was perhaps an act of collective madness on the part of people, that somehow India lost its moorings in that summer. Whether the sun played a role or not, I don't know. But that the BJP and its earlier avatar, the Janasangh, have always lacked pedigree, they've lacked depth, and they've lacked respectability. That has been a narration which has taken place for a long, long time. Earlier this year, a good friend of mine, Ramchandra Guha, wrote a rather long article called "Where Are the Right Intellectuals?" where he said, and if I may summarize it in one line, that they don't exist. So, under the circumstances, the tendency for people to look at the BJP as the stupid party, a term which I borrow from the political discourse in Britain. Or even the nasty party, a term which was used for the Conservatives at the time during the high noon of the Blair years, I recall. That is still very recurrent. And I dare say the narrative has gone around that everything this party, this movement, this family represents goes against the idea of India, and that's got no relation with the wonderful book Sunil has written. And I hope that the recurrent debate on the idea of India has added to its sails. I know it's bad form to read history backwards. However, if we accept that the election of the Modi government was not undertaken as a sort of a fit of knee-jerk exasperation with the earlier regime, it necessarily follows that there were pre-existing historical strands that were either undetected or unrecognized. I hope to examine some of these, but let me add a few caveats. One, as Sunil has mentioned, I'm not a professional academic anymore. I'm at best I can call myself a lapsed historian. I do participate in the rather cacophonic public discussions which take place in what passes off as the media in India. And therefore, I do acknowledge that many academics may perhaps find my presentation somewhat journalistic, and I know that's not a term of endearment. But at the same time, many of my observations will be based on a ringside view of Indian politics, particularly the second and third lectures, where I've been a detached observer at times and a not so detached participant at other times. Secondly, the serious dissection of Indian conservatives, of Indian conservatism, is relatively new, and it's a work in progress. I'll make no claim to be comprehensive, which in any case is near impossible in the case of a country like India, where it is said, for everything that's true, the opposite is equally true. Third, in examining what I consider Indian conservatism, I'm conscious that I might be overstressing the experiences of what may be called Middle India. This implies that the recent preoccupation with gender studies, Dalit studies, and other postmodernist studies may not be addressed at all. In addition, since history is being read backwards and addressing concerns thrown up by recent developments, I am not touching on an equally important subject, which is conservatism in Muslim politics. Now, modern conservatism, or at any rate, conservatism in democratic politics, is said to have originated as a reaction to the French Revolution in the late 18th century. However, a working and consensual definition of what conservatism is remains a very daunting project for a number of reasons, not least of which is the equation of the term with the more omnibus term right-wing and the more judgmental term reactionary, preferred by polemicists. There is, of course, a general disinclination on the part of conservatives themselves to subject their beliefs and their convictions to theoretical constructs. In the 1930s, Arthur Bryant, well, a historian who was probably as famous as Niall Ferguson is to today in those days, wrote an interesting pamphlet, well, a little more than a pamphlet, called The Spirit of Conservatism. And in the foreword to that was a good Tory from the Shires, Colonel John Buchan. And he said that conservatism is above all things a spirit, and the fruits of that spirit are continuity and unity. Now, metaphysical as this may be, it is not very enlightening as to what exactly. And I think it summarizes what I've been saying, that conservatism normally is very not prone, conservatives are not prone to defining themselves. In fact, if you go back to Burke, supposed to be the sort of father of what is called modern conservatism, you'll find that he has serious strictures against what he calls abstraction. Because he said sweeping generalizations negate, respect, they don't acknowledge, the human frailty and the context of history. Now this, again, is a point that we cannot be defined. Roger Scruton, who's probably by far the most academic of the conservatives, has written, and Scruton is very blunt and brutal. He says you can't prefer an argument and be a human being at the same time. I recall him once saying that. He suggested that conservatism may rarely announce itself in maxims, formula, or aims. This lack of confidence stems not from diffidence or dismay, but from an awareness of the complexity of human things and from an attachment to values which cannot be understood with the abstract clarity of utopian purpose. Now, this would reaffirm the conviction of people in the left bank, or for that matter, Jawaharlal Nehru University, that it is the stupid party we are talking about, a stupid movement which cannot address and do define itself. The second problem which is posed by conservatism is that there is nothing universal about it. To suggest that there can be something called the conservative international would be an oxymoron. Conservatism, as Disraeli defined it long ago, 150 years ago, is national or it is nothing. And I think that is very common. These days in Delhi, for example, we've seen the advent of a lot of American think tanks coming in, preferring their ideas of what right politics in India should be. And the exchanges have been met by a quality of mutual incomprehension. I don't think either side realizes what the other side is all about. And yet, in some way or the other, both define themselves as conservatives. Yet, despite these constraints, let me just reduce this number of tenets to a few principles, if at all the word principles can be used. The first, to my mind, which is very important, is the preference for community wisdom over individual choice. This is, to my mind, at the heart of what can be called conservatism, as I see it. And I'm not necessarily using it as conservatism is defined in a very David Cameronish sort of way. I'm looking at it more in terms of historical evolution of the term. So the vagaries of British conservatism or American conservatism need not, while interesting in themselves, are not the way in which the commonalities can be understood. I think Burke put it quite well. He said the individual is foolish, but the species is wise. Prejudices and prescriptions are the instruments which the wisdom of the species employ to safeguard man against his own passion and appetites. And I think if you look at some of the literature on British conservatism, you'll find unending references, at least the pre-war British conservatism, to the ancient constitution before the Norman yoke. A mythical past, maybe not mythical, may not be mythical. It's not for me to go into that. So, as they would say it, only a very small fraction of human knowledge is actually codified. The greater part is embedded in instinct, in custom, in prejudice, in ancient usage, which in most cases should be respected. That's the community spirit as conservatives see it. In practical terms, this translates into a respect for what has often been called the unreflective but deeply felt values of the normal citizen. If any of you happen to have developed an interest in Australian politics, you'd find that in the 1940s, Bob Menzies, one of the long-standing prime ministers of Australia, almost a contemporary of Jawaharlal Nehru and was prime minister around the same time, made what is called the Forgotten People's speech on radio in 1942, where he touched upon these. And it's that same thing about the long shadows speech which John Major delivered, of certain the familiarity of symbolism, of that ordinary person sitting inside a home who's thinking with robust values, with a sense of common decencies which define them. Secondly, and this is a more problematic area, the importance attached to the sacred in maintaining life and bolstering nature. Now, this is not uncontested. There have been other conservative philosophers, Michael Oakeshott I can think of, who've sort of disagreed with this formulation of putting faith at the heart of conservatism. But I'm often reminded of the American, who calls himself a neoconservative, Irving Kristol, who wrote that without the religious dimension, the conservative disposition is thin gruel. Now, even as late as 1959, in another pamphlet which Lord Hailsham, Quintin Hogg, as he used to be called at that time, not then, but Lord Hailsham, addressing the case for the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom, and it's as late as 1959, Macmillan, I think, was the Prime Minister, he wrote that there can be no genuine conservatism which is not founded upon a religious view of the basis of civil obligation, and there can be no true religion where the basis of civil obligation is treated as purely secular. So the idea that faith is an important element of conservatism is not by any means an Oriental discovery. It is very much at the heart of the Occidental view of conservatism as well. Third, there is the belief that the authority of the state must be circumscribed by the will of society. In short, the state should not impose any preconceived version of the good on a reluctant society. So, this naturally presumes that a conservative is innately and inherently suspicious of all state-sponsored cultural engineering. Now, some conservatives have extended this argument to say that since it's not a transactional relationship which the state has with the citizen, the state cannot enter into an economic arrangement with the citizen, because that debases the role of the state per se. And this is at the heart of what is called the economic right in the United States, where an extreme form of laissez-faire is often posited as the ultimate aim of conservatism. But, as I say, this by no means is the only formulation. Finally, in defining conservatism, I would suggest that conservatism sees itself as the embodiment of the national identity. A conservative is more than a patriot. He's simultaneously a nationalist. To the conservative, it is insufficient to be merely wedded to what is now fashionably called constitutional patriotism, a term which has become in vogue, particularly in Germany, since the 50s. In France, if you take one example, the citizenry gets through republics as frequently as Zaza Gabor may have got through her husbands. But that does not necessarily mean that France does not have a national identity. The French national identity, therefore, is rarely to be found in political institutions. It's to be found in other forms. It may be found in cuisine, it may be found in culture, it may be found in facets, like even to some extent, religion. In Germany, too, you saw that mismatch. And there's a fierce debate which took place in Germany all over the 19th century between the separation of culture and politics. So, at best, constitutional patriotism can demarcate a conservative from a fascist. But it cannot serve as the basis of national identity. David Miller, a colleague of mine who was at Nuffield, the philosopher, suggested that constitutional patriotism doesn't provide any sense of the historical identity of the community that binds present-day politics to decisions made and actions performed in the past. As he put it, a private set of cultural values cannot substitute for a public understanding of the terms on which we are going to carry out our collective life. In other words, to use a British example, this cultural Englishness has often been cited: love of dogs, love of cricket, love of the football, respect for the monarchy, or in the case of Professor Dwyer, love of elephants. But does that in itself constitute adequate force to bring it as a force of national identity? To my mind, that's debatable. Of course, we can have a larger debate over what constitutes public understanding of the facets of national identity. And yes, that itself can be contested. But that there is a need for one, I don't think needs to be contested. Now, what these truncated principles which I've outlined so far suggest that it's useful to locate Indian conservatism within certain parameters which are common. But there are differences. First, both English, or should I say British, and American conservatism emerged in self-governing nation states with democracies that evolved and matured over the centuries. India, on the other hand, lost its sovereign status, was a subject nation for long. Now, for how long is again a matter of great dispute within India. Was it 1,000 years? Was it 250 years, etc.? So, the manifestations of conservatism in India are certainly likely to be very, very different from that of the Western democracies. And there'll be greater focus, naturally, at least prior to 1947, on custom, on culture, on religion, national pride, than on political institutions. Then there is the problem posed by translation. In his book on liberalism, Chris Bailey pointed out that he couldn't exactly get a fix on what is the indigenous Sanskrit stroke Hindi or some other Sanskritic language equivalent of liberalism. At best, he said, he found the word udarvad, which wasn't terribly satisfactory. I did a round robin in Delhi to find out what could be defined as conservatism in Hindi or Sanskrit. And I came across similarly frustrating. The best solution was preferred to me by Pratap Bhanu Mehta, who told me that see it as an opposite of something. So, if it is the opposite of liberal, it becomes Anudarpanthi. If it's opposed to progressive, it becomes Rudhivadi. If it's anti-revolutionary, it's Kranti Virodhi. If it's anti-egalitarian, it's Samantavadi or Asamantavadi. And if it's opposed to state control, it's Vaishvik. Now, it's quite clear, none of these are entirely very satisfactory. And one of the reasons why the term conservatism suffers from non-usage, relative non-usage in India, is because it's conceptually blurred. And people prefer the term with a sneer attached to it, right-wing or reactionary. And the conservatives themselves prefer to define themselves as Rashtravadi, which is nationalist. But again, they have no monopoly over the Rashtravadi claim. You see, the spectacular influence of Western thought on India has been well documented, particularly in the 19th and 20th century. They've talked about the role, the influence of Mill, of Bentham, of Corte, and subsequently Marx. But by comparison, the influences on what might be called Indian conservatism have been insufficiently explored. Because the influences were not, although in the case of certain individual writers they have been there, were not principally Western. They were indigenous and had their roots in Sanskrit literature. They had their roots in custom more than anything else and tradition. So which is one of the reasons why it's been listed. So the study of conservatism is still at a very nascent stage. Now, the relative newness of the liberal-conservative dichotomy in Indian thought, particularly as it evolved from the 19th century, has prompted some people, and Christopher Bailey again is the best one, the one I want to cite, who argued that in India, liberalism and neoconservatism were joined at the hip from birth. In defining who was a member of which camp, the lines are often very, very blurred. I want to take the case of two individuals in the 19th century from Bengal. One was Pandit Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, and the other Raja Radhakanta Dev. Now, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar is probably the better known of the two. He was the principal of the Sanskrit College for a long time. He played a very, very important role in ensuring widow remarriage takes place, which is supposed to be a step forward and a continuation of the tradition of the anti-sati movement and anti-sati legislation, which the Benthamites, along with Raja Ram Mohan Roy and other, pioneered in the 1830s. At the same time, it is worth recalling that Vidyasagar joined hands with the rest of Bengali society in opposing the Age of Consent Act, which I think brought the marriageable age to 14, if I'm not mistaken, at that particular point. Both his endorsement of widow remarriage and his opposition to tinkering with the institution of marriage in the Age of Consent legislation were based on reading of the Shastras and not from any secular concerns of gender equity, although he may have had personally a great deal of compassion for those who were at the receiving end of premature widowhood. Likewise, as principal of Sanskrit College, Vidyasagar endorsed the admission of castes into the college to learn Sanskrit, but opposed allowing access to Sanskrit education to anyone who was called of the Sudra community. This included even the very rich Subarna Baniks of Calcutta, the most prosperous merchants of Calcutta, because he felt that at that time they lacked respectability and their ritual status was very low. What is very curious is that in giving this advice to the government, he, however, prefaced an argument that saying the Shastras actually allow full Sanskrit education to anyone who seeks it. So the conflict between one man who at one time talks about the Shastras and at another time who talks about what is expedient and as far as custom is concerned. So the conflicts between the two are very sharp. Where do we fit him in that liberal conservative dichotomy? Take the case of Raja Radhakantadev, who has been who was at some time made an object of vilification by progressive historians because he was one of the most prominent opponents of Ram Mohan Roy's legislation against bid to outlaw sati. He was one of the principal architects of what was called the Dharma Sabha, which was essentially an institution which was set up to protect Hinduism from both Christian evangelism and government interference. Yet, Radhakantadev served as director of Hindu College, which was at that time the government college, for 30 years. In addition, he was an important functionary of the Calcutta School Society and authored an important manual on the education of women. Now, the only historian I know who's actually studied Radhakantadev and say, relatively, he's been not studied at great length, suggested that Radhakantadev tried to drive a wedge between English education and English ideas. The first, in his view, was functionally useful, and the second, socially unsettling. Now, one of the reasons why the modern liberal conservative divide seems very problematic in assessing these two very distinguished individuals lie in their very similar concerns over colonial rule. When Clive defeated Siraj-ud-Dawla and Plassey, it is said that the merchants of Calcutta celebrated as their point of great liberation. Now, despite the subsequent hiccups caused by dual government, particularly a horrific famine which resulted, there was a broad consensus in Bengali Hindu society, at least, that British rule was a marked improvement from what prevailed earlier. However, at the same time, this did not obscure the realization that India had become a subject nation and had lost its sovereign status. The shame this generated and the misgivings over Christian missionary activity and the government's cultural engineering coexisted rather uneasily with hyperbolic expressions of loyalty. There's a very wonderful description of the opposition to the Age of Consent Act, where, if anyone understands Bengali, they'll say the slogan was, Kali Ma Dharmo Rukha Karo. That means, Kali, please protect our thing. And at the same time, they were shouting, Maharani Joy. Means praising Queen Victoria. So Tapan Rai Chaudhary has called it a very neurotic attitude, which marked the Indian intellectual response to British rule. But neurotic or not, India did witness an intellectual ferment, basically triggered by this colonial encounter. And Bailey, again here, has detected a broad and internally contested range of thought and practice directed to the pursuit of political and social liberty, its common features were a desire to re-empower India's people with personal freedom, and its targets were despotic government, embodied traditional authority, and debased religious practices. But there was at the same time a parallel current which sought to preserve, strengthen, and where necessary, modify indigenous social institutions, twin it with personal and community reawakening, and contribute to resurgent nationhood. So the two currents weren't necessarily at loggerheads. Indeed, they were often complementary to each other. But there were sharp differences over priorities and divergent concerns about how much to conserve and how much to change and redefine society. These differences were less evident till the mid-20th century, but they became part of the larger political schism after independence. Now, in assessing why India had become a subject nation, that was one of the major preoccupations of the day. Why have we fallen so low? Why have we become slaves to people who don't even have the enlightened wisdom of the Vedas? This was a preoccupation which was recurrent all along. Now, along with this preoccupation, there was a concern about what can we learn from those who have conquered us. Now, one of the most fascinating characters was a person called Bhudeb Mukherjee, a writer, a conservative writer, who believed in following traditional rituals. At the same time, he was also a member of a Masonic lodge. How the two went hand in hand is an intriguing question. Now, he complimented the British for their willpower, skills, and mutual sympathy, the result of observing codes appropriate for their country and their faith. The patriotism of the British, he felt, transcended even their codes of morality. So that was something to be admired. And this is reflected even much later in Maharashtra by R.G. Bhandarkar in the social conference in, I think, late 1880s where he talked. And he talked about how Europe is far ahead of what in everything that constitutes civilization. Now, one of the great writers of the 19th century, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, the author of Vande Mataram, actually attributed this to the Hindu penchant for asceticism, abstruse philosophical speculation, and their corresponding failure to master the world of nature. In Maharashtra, where Shivaji and his successors preferred, albeit momentarily, a possible Hindu revival after Mughal decline, the popular historical plays of that time always highlighted the importance of charitra, character, as being the foundation on which anything can be built, society can be built. And this wasn't reflected only in popular plays. Someone like the historian Sir Jadunath Sarkar, who used to be a very popular person, read till he was junked in the 1970s by progressive history. Now, Jadunath Sarkar always talked about character as being the ultimate shaper of destiny. And the Mughal Empire, in his mind, fell, not for any other reason, but because the functionaries of the Mughals lacked character. And he kept on driving this. The message was quite clear. Indians must first develop character. Now, Jadunath Sarkar is a very fascinating example of a person who believed very strongly in the indigenous institutions of India. But he felt equally strongly that India had lost its bearings, lost its character, and therefore needed a prolonged period of British rule to actually bring it and make it ready for self-government. As late as 1945, when he was asked about the future, he says, India is not prepared for self-rule. We need a period of enlightened despotism for another 50 years, till 1995. Now, the remedy to these people did not lie, of course, in emulating British social codes and behavior, copying the externalities of European civilization, what Bankim Chandra Chatterjee called the gluttony of beef eating. It lay to them in delving into facets of the Hindu inheritance that needed to be either re-nourished, rediscovered. Now, Bankim Chandra is quite clear. Religion, in its broadest and most legitimate sense, is culture. And it is in religion that the proto-conservatives of India sought India's redemption. Now, for some people, it meant adhering rigidly to the Shastric code. Hinduism for them, they did not mean a set of beliefs, but it meant following custom. You do exactly what your forefathers did in terms of certain ritual obligations. Your beliefs are secondary. That was a feature of, for example, Bhudev Mukherjee. Bankim Chandra, on the other hand, wanted a Puranic revival. He sought to Baudelarize Krishna. Take out the more steamier bits from the life of Krishna, which he thought were later additions, and actually create a Puranic revival based on what he called the dharmic code of Nishkarma Karma, which is selflessness. Vivekananda, who in his personal life was attached to bhakti, who actually went off in search of a master to discover the Godhead, later modified it thing, and actually sought to enlarge the question of personal search for God with service to the poor. So it was his commitment, his social service, which preempted a lot of Gandhi's constructive nationalism, was also mediated through the agency of religion. And finally, there was Dayanand Saraswati in the Punjab, for whom re-embracing a pure Vedic religion, minus all the Brahmanical corruption, particularly the practice of untouchability, meant that was the moment of Indian resurgence could come about. Now, there were three themes that linked these religio-cultural approaches to national recovery. The first, and here I go back to the older conservative tradition, was the inherent suspicion of individualism. This was the point of departure from the liberal tradition. It was the conquest of the self and its merger into the larger corporate mission that formed the basis of these expressions, early expressions of what was called non-political patriotism. Now, take a case of a very great activist, Swami Shraddhanand, Arya Samaj activist, played a very major role in the 1920s. Now, according to him, and I'm just quoting it at length because you get a sense of the flavor of the language used, the imagery which they have. And he wrote, the great Aryan nation is said at the present moment to be a dying race, not because its members are dwindling, but because it is completely disorganized. Individually, man to man, second to none in intellect and physique, possessing a code of morality unapproachable by any other race of humanity, the Hindu nation is still helpless on account of its manifold divisions and selfishness. So we are great, but we haven't been able to achieve the potential of our greatness because we are bound by either internal schisms or by attachment to beliefs which have no relevance, which are divisive in nature. So an energized political culture, it was presumed, was prefaced on the self-discovery of the people through corporate citizenship. This is a theme that resonates strongly, for example, with the RSS. The RSS has placed the molding of character and the implantation of what they call samskars, that is tradition, at the heart of the nation-building activity. Now, again, I'll quote, just to get the flavor of it, what Golwalkar. Now, Golwalkar is really the person who created the RSS. He was not the founder, but he was the person who actually defined the RSS and what it means. And he wrote that all our great authorities on mental discipline have ordained us not to succumb to overflow of emotions and weep in the name of God, but to apply ourselves to a strict discipline of day-to-day penance. Effusion of emotions will only shatter the nerves and make the person weaker than before, leaving him a moral wreck. Now, whether this is a codified Indian version of the stiff upper lip is a matter for anyone to guess. But certainly what is passed off in Britain as the sort of public school ethos of controlling your emotions and molding your character to a common purpose, a gentlemanly code in the case of Britain, does recur in that. And in fact, Golwalkar goes on to say that it is the undigested modern ideas that are playing havoc in the minds of our young men who look upon freedom as license and restraint, look upon freedom as license and restraint as mental regimentation. In other words, self-control. The recipe for national regeneration has to lie in individual self-control and molding the character to suit a larger, broader vision. Secondly, as part of this larger agenda, was the elevation of India into one of godliness. The unity of India, its sacredness, its destiny were intertwined as never before, particularly by people like Sri Aurobindo, who equated worship of the motherland with the Sanatan Dharma. Now, true, there have been other scholars, like the historian Radha Kumud Mukherjee, who said, well, actually, patriotism is not something new, but it can be located even within the Vedas, like most things, I presume. But this was not really what most people believed. Now, Bankim Chandra, for instance, played an immense role in the deification of India, the imagery of Mother India through Vande Mataram. But he saw this very much as a part of an invented tradition. He didn't use the words invented tradition. He said the ancients had made a mistake by submerging patriotism into the higher love of all created things, and the balance had to be redressed. So again, the modification of existing traditions to suit what is called a larger corporate citizenship. Finally, and this is really the final point, which is there was a heady sense of loss for Indian conservatism. The issue of the 1,000 years of servitude. And a revitalized feeling of Hinduness, which all of them, all the writers, the thinkers of that time, sought to impart, was calculated to exclude, or had the effect of excluding, non-Indic faiths from the national project. The initial reason for this lack of inclusiveness included the Hindu historical memory of subordination under Mughal rule, the bitter aftertaste of temple destruction, the mounting anger against Christian evangelism, and overall the upper caste, or caste Hindu disavowal of all those who had forsaken their ancestral faith. The problem of this exclusivist nationalism in regions where the Muslims were in a majority were not fully comprehended around the late part of the 19th century, till the census. For example, it is only after the census that the Bengali Bhadralok realized that the Muslims constitute a majority in what was then the United Province, the Bengal Presidency. It was only after the census that he realized that in Punjab what the demographic balance was. And this idea of trying to actually now cope with the reality that other faiths had to be accommodated only took shape once the idea of democratic governance began to loom large, post 1909. The separate electorates that came into play after 1909, unfortunately, however, instead of actually narrowing the gap, increased the polarization because you were addressing ghettoized societies. The attempts to address what might loosely be called the Muslim question, therefore, were very patchy and yielded very modest results. In northern India, the Arya Samaj initiated bouts of reconversion, the precursor of what is called the Ghar Wapasi now, which led to counter movements of the Muslims, which reaffirmed their own separate identity and negated all traces of what was called pre-Islamic inheritance from there. So the cultural gap between the two communities actually increased sharply after this realization. Now, Gandhi, on his part, tried to craft an alliance with pan-Islamism through the Khilafat movement. It was short-lived, ended in complete disaster, and actually aggravated the process of antagonisms. Jawaharlal Nehru sought, with his leftist friends, to find an economic commonality between Hindus and Muslims and therefore forge a basis of an economic nationalism. That too got nowhere. And in Uttar Pradesh and the Deccan, the Muslim elite, still grieving the loss of political power after the Mughals, resisted the idea of a common democratic future with a non-Muslim majority. Therefore, the need to guard against Muslim and Christian encroachments into the Hindu turf triggered a larger campaign by Hindu bodies to prevent the detachment of Adivasis, untouchables, and lower castes from the Hindu Samaj. Mahatma Gandhi's fast in 1932 against the Pune Pact was basically, for the first time in his life, a direct Hindu intervention to keep the integrity of Hindu society intact. It didn't provide it was an important step in enhancing Gandhi's credentials as a Hindu leader. But it never quite resolved the question which had been there, which is, how is this nationalism, how is this conservative force going to deal with this Muslim question? And then happened partition. Now, partition didn't provide all the answers either, but it certainly enhanced the viability of nationhood crafted on the strength of an energized Hindu ethos. So ironically, this is what it did. By actually removing substantially a problem which they had never been able to reconcile themselves to. Now, how this played out in India, in independent India, and formed the basis of the new militant conservatism will be the subject of the next two lectures. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Swapan. That was a characteristic combination of thoughtfulness, erudition, and provocation. And tomorrow you'll have a chance to start asking questions of Swapan after the lecture. Tomorrow's lecture is on Indian conservatism as a protest movement. But you can start the questioning process straight away at a reception, which we'll now hold. There's wine and snacks which will be served. You're all invited. We'll probably move the back row seats just to the side so we have a bit more space. But once again, thank you very much, Swapan, for a terrific setup for the next two lectures.